Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining our third ABC Parenting and Family SIG webinar. We're delighted to have you with us here today and just wanted to make you aware that this webinar is being recorded so that this and our other webinars in the series can be available on our Google Sites page, which I'm going to link in the chat at this point so that you can access it now or in the future. And I am just delighted to introduce our two speakers for today. Dr. Tim Cavell is a professor in the Department of Psychological Science at the University of Arkansas. He's a clinical child and family psychologist and prevention researcher. His work focuses on school-based prevention for aggressive children at risk for later substance use and school support for children from military families. Dr. Lauren Quetch is the assistant professor in the Department of Psychological Science at the University of Arkansas and has a specialty in clinical child psychology that she obtained through her PhD at West Virginia University. Her research focuses on children with disruptive behavior and autism spectrum disorder. Drs. Cavell and Quetch co-wrote the parenting book, Good Enough Parenting, a 6-point plan for stronger relationships with your child, and the Practitioner's Therapeutic Guide, Working with Parents of Aggressive Children, a practitioner's guide, both of which provide the foundation for their talk today. At this time, please join me in welcoming both Dr. Cavell and Dr. Quetch.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Lauren, you want to start us off?
Sure, let's do it. Thank you everyone for coming today. We are really excited to talk to you about what we've been working on the last several years. It was a labor of love and a great collaboration. Specifically, we have two books that are related to this topic. So there's us, your collaborative team. A little context. I was hired at the University of Arkansas in 2019, and Tim had sort of curated throughout his an impressive career to this point, so much useful information about how to work with families and youth, especially aggressive children. And he had these amazing ideas that he had come up with and even written down, and asked me when I was hired if I would want to help him sort of craft these products. And I said, absolutely. Without hesitation, yes. So one of the first things that came of this was this parent-focused book called Good Enough Parenting. I have my own copy right here. And it's really written in a way that's accessible for many families. So the idea is that families do not have to be in therapy. They can just buy this book, and it's sort of a life guide, if you will, on trying to understand, what are the important aspects of what we need to do as parents to help ensure that our relationship is really strong with our kids, help overcome challenges such as aggressive behaviors with children. But, you don't have to be in therapy to use it, but it's a great guide based on research, but very accessible. And then the other book that is geared toward clinicians, whether that is you or students potentially could utilize this, or someone else within the practice setting. This provides a lot more context about the research that supports this parenting book, and strategies to work with families of aggressive kids. So if you're a clinician, you can utilize this book to help guide you, and the family book can be utilized alongside that for families that you're working with, or families can just independently have the book.
All right. Thank you, Lauren. So you probably have heard the term the good enough mother. It was coined back in '53 by a person named Donald Winnicott. And Winnicott's premise was that good enough mothers, this is before the days when we recognized that there were both mothers and fathers doing the work, That good enough mothers recognize how fragile infants are and are thus attuned to their needs. But good enough mothers also fail at times. And in doing so, they actually allow their children to find ways of doing things and to have emotions, experience those emotions without being criticized. So from his standpoint, the ordinary parent, the imperfect parent, the good enough parent benefited children's development. So in our book, The Good Enough, which is called Good Enough Parenting, we wanted to provide an up-to-date version of Winnicott's Good Enough Mother. And like Winnicott, we are champions of the ordinary parent. We believe that most parents have an inherent capacity to promote their child's development, while also recognizing that things can get in the way of parenting, like stress, mental illness, and other life perturbations. And like Winnicott, we believe it is more important for parents to be devoted than to be clever. And like Winnicott, we see potential danger in how people like us sometimes define good versus bad parenting. So this is maybe a bit provocative, but we'll see what you think about it. We believe that parents are unduly burdened when professionals promulgate what we call the myth of effective parenting, which we would suggest comes in three parts. The first is that we experts have identified a specific set of child rearing skills that are recommended for all parents, regardless of the parent, the child, or the circumstances affecting the family and the context of the child rearing. And if children are behaving badly, well, then obviously parents must lack effective parenting skills. And if parents use the right skill at the right time in life, then there should be absolutely no reason for child misbehavior. So the research that underlies what we did in our effort to simplify and humanize the science of parenting has evolved along two strands. The first is that pursued primarily by developmental psychologists who study processes by which parents and parenting influence children's growth and development. And the other is pursued primarily by clinical researchers, many of whom are in ABCT, interested in behaviorally oriented, parent-based interventions for children displaying disruptive behavior and other conduct problems. So in our practitioner book, we integrate these two strands into a single coherent guidebook. And the parent book is you can think of it as a rendering of that practitioner book specifically for parents. So it's important to recognize that the research on parent-based interventions for disruptive behavior is a very mature field. It's been around for quite a while. I love this table from Okamura et al., where they were looking at this notion of distillation. Can we distill different protocols down to the essential elements? And if you look at this table, treatment studies focused on disruptive behavior are second only to treatment studies, the number of RCTs, to that of anxiety in terms of protocols and the number of RCTs. And the number of practice elements for disruptive behavior is second only to that for suicide. So a lot of protocols and a lot of practice elements. However, when you plot over time, like Okamura and colleagues did, you see that the number of new practice elements has virtually plateaued for the last 50 years. There's not a lot of new stuff that's revolutionizing how we do parent-based interventions for disruptive behavior problems. So what that means is that researchers have begun to try to identify the elements of parent-based interventions that are most strongly linked to positive outcomes. Morris et al. Identified a list of 7 essential content areas. And in their list, they emphasize what they said is the functional nature of each element. And I think you can read that to mean distinct from the topography, the topographical nature of the element. So one can be doing a parenting technique, but it not have the function that's intended. So Morris et al. Were emphasizing the functional nature of each element. how these elements serve to support parenting, child development, or family functioning. They also observed that the most effective components focus on providing parents with skills aimed at enhancing the overall quality of the parent-child relationship. Here there are 7 essential content areas. You can read those. Everything from emotion socialization, parenting, nurturing parenting, a lot of consistent discipline, the usual suspects, if you will. So our take from this is that the job of parenting, and this is true for both books, is first and foremost a relationship. In fact, I have sometimes take issue with the term parent training. I really think that underestimates the complexity of this work. I actually think there's a better term is parent therapy, much like we talked about couples therapy is trying to help a relationship that's a bit wobbly, not going well, it's conflicted. I think the same thing could be said of the work we do with parents. It's I think to call it training is again to underestimate its complexity and to put the focus in things that are not necessarily primarily important. So decades of research indicate that parents and parenting are key contributors to children's socialization. That's the game here, right? Socialization is the process by which children grow to become healthy, law-abiding members of their community. Thus, the job of parenting is to establish and maintain the kind of relationship with your child that promotes their socialization. But that raises the question of, well, what is a socializing relationship? What does that entail? And so this is sort of a further distillation, if you will. So our take is that key are parents' capacity to accept, to contain, and lead. And what you can see there is our effort to simplify, to categorize the work of parents and parenting in ways that are relatively easily understood, okay? And so this is less the language of 50 years ago, which were behavior modification techniques were borrowed and put into parent training programs. So this is a more, we would think, a user-friendly language. And when parents provide these conditions over time in a coordinated fashion, they reduce the risk associated with children's use of coercion and aggression. We also push the notion that the relationship, helping the parent-child relationship, should take prominence over building skills. That by emphasizing the conditions needed for a socializing parent-child relationship, we avoid this overly prescriptive approach to parenting, one that is focused rather narrowly on a supposed effective parenting skills set. So it's not narrowly defined. And this is justified by the fact that a lack of parenting skills is seldom the sole or primary cause. It's rare for a study to first go in and document the parents lack skills. And in fact, if you go to our practitioner book, we talk about studies that have done sometimes years ago where a pretty good demonstration that parents, even of disrupted kids, have the capacity to exercise adequate skills, but that's not the thing that gets in their way. So just know that we're more focused on the things that can disrupt and impede parenting, and not just skill promotion or skill acquisition. A lot of things can disrupt or impede parenting. Child effects, some children have difficulty with self-regulation. And sometimes the context of childhood is marked by poor parental health, marital strain, intimate partner violence, lack of family resources, racial oppression. And so you've got this challenge of establishing and maintaining a socializing relationship for 18 plus years. And so also needed in this mix are adaptive parenting goals, adequate parental health, and a coherent family structure. So now we've expanded our notion of the essential elements to include these other things. So we refer to these as the 6 pillars of good enough parenting. Accept, lead, and pro-social values is another way of saying lead and contain, and then family structure, parenting goals, and parental self-care. All right. So what's interesting about parenting goals is that it's not a common focus of parent-based interventions. In fact, it's not a common focus of work with parents generally. It seems to be assumed that we all know what the goals of parenting are. Well, I think it's true that we make some assumptions about what the goals of parenting are to achieve for children, but we don't pull back and focus more narrowly on parenting behaviors. What are the goals for parents' behaviors? So we think about parenting goals as specific to what parents do in their role as parents. And it's not to be confused with goals parents have for their children. We encourage parents to set clear, explicit goals for their parenting. And we draw from the science of parenting and the science of risk and protective factors when discussing the useful goals of parenting. There are things that parents do that are important to do. There are some things that parents can do that may not matter that much. So we caution parents also about being careful about emotion-driven parenting goals that are often unrecognized, embedded in parenting, that's overlearned and automatic. So we make explicit this notion of what are the goals that are going to guide your parenting behavior. We make that a focus. Lauren?
All right, thanks, Tim. So one of the really essential components that I think is often kind of thrown in at the end when we talk about some of these family-based interventions is like, oh yeah, we also need to make sure that the parents are okay, make sure that they're healthy, right? So we're asking in a lot of these interventions for them to do a ton. And for those of you that work with kids, they come in and some parents are like, wait, I have to be in the room? Like I thought I was going to drop my kid off and I thought that you were going to fix them, right? And so when we ask a lot of parents to essentially rearrange how they're interacting with their child, how their default way of responding to their child is, how they are creating new goals for themselves and their family, we assume there's a certain level of competence there. And if you just do it, things will get better, right? But when we ask that of parents, we sometimes fail to assess, but how are you doing, right? What is it that you need in order to be able to do the things that we're asking you to do, right? And so health is not just, sometimes we have this assumption that was like physical health, right? Which can play a factor in how people feel and how they're able to navigate the world. But for us, when speaking about health, it was more global and how are you doing physically and emotionally, right? So this is such a necessary component of that parent-child relationship because you are not just a partner in this relationship, right? You are carrying often this relationship. And within that, it means that more is tasked of you as a parent than the child. We don't ask children to make us feel better when we're sad, right? We don't ask children to do everything so that our lives are always easy. That's not what kids do. And as a parent, we need to be thoughtful about what do we need in carrying this relationship for us to be present and thoughtful in our parenting goals, right? So we look a lot at emotional science and we talk about what are the functions of our emotions, right? So if my immediate reaction is anger, right? Is there something behind that? Is that anger masking sadness, disappointment, or something else? So it's easy to react in anger. And yet, what is it telling us about what we need or what's happening within our family, right? So how do we enhance parental emotional health and well-being? So we talk about mindfulness a bit and how to be mindful in the moment. And recognizing, again, pulling back to those goals allows us to be mindful. So for a lot of parents, right, it's this idea of, well, it's easy to react in the moment. And we would say it's okay to have emotions. And how do we behave after we have that emotion? So I'm angry at my kid, but maybe my parenting goal is along the lines of, I want to be a good model for my child. I don't want to yell at them. So how do I sit with that in the moment so I can reach my long-term goal of, not yelling at my kid? I think you hopped. Did we hop ahead one, Tim? Yeah. Can you go back one, Tim? Yes. Nope. One more. There we go. So another important component of this then that we have to look at is the family structure, right? So there are, now we've got our goals and we've got our sights on those goals. Now we have, how am I addressing my own needs as a parent? And maybe that's outside of the home, right? Maybe that's how I'm reacting within the home, all of these components. And now we have to think about, well, what does my family look like? How do we generally function? And so structure is really looking at, what does this family look like and what do we do in our daily lives and in sort of making our family feel special and connected. So there are 4 things that we talk about. We call them the 4 R's, which are rules, routines, roles, and rituals. So for rules, what we're really thinking is about what do we say are things that we have to abide by within our family, right? So these are sparingly used. We're carefully thinking about these with families. And it can revolve around things such as sibling relationships and peer interactions. So a rule about, potentially keeping a child safe or who they're interacting with outside of the home, since peers can be a very big influence as adolescents, kids become adolescents. So what are the rules that we're going to have as a family? And it doesn't mean that we have a laundry list of rules, because no one can abide by a laundry list of rules, but what are important to our families and what are the things that we are going to say, this is always something that we will follow through on as a family. Routines are more daily, weekly, sort of things that happen within our lives that help create structure and safety and predictability. So, when we pay the bills is sort of a routine in our life, making sure that our lights are on and our water's still coming in, right? Who's doing the laundry or the process of laundry, how we eat meals, and how we drop kids off at the bus. What does that feel like? What is our daily routine, our weekly routine, and how is the flow of life? And if we don't have routines, that can enhance our chaos and it leads to more conflict and interactions that are hard within the home. And then for roles, what we're really talking about is understanding parents and where, that they are the authority figure in the family, and how do we create appropriate boundaries within the home so that children aren't feeling confused about, who's doing what? And, am I as a parent, for example, oversharing with my children about things, or am I relying on them for comfort, or am I pitting kids against each other? Right. Am I using my child to justify my actions against my partner? So understanding what are our roles and how do we make sure that if we have multiple caregivers in the home, that they're aligned with one another, and how is that those boundaries and role expectations separate from our kids? And then the last thing I just wanted to mention here too was rituals. And so understanding that these may be things that I almost think of it as like things that we celebrate or we look forward to as a family. So these can be large celebrations. You may have rituals in your own family of what you do around Thanksgiving or around special holidays, right? How do we celebrate people's accomplishments and birthdays? And it can also be, it doesn't have to be huge all the time either. It can be, do we have special meals where everyone gathers happening, whether it's weekly or more infrequently. So family structure really provides context of who is this family and how do they function together. And so this really leads to this sort of next three aspects that are really important in parenting work. And Tim mentioned these earlier, but we put these together because they are so important for one another in order to be an effective parent. So the idea here is having these accept, contain, and leading allow for this relationship, this socializing relationship for the child and for the parent and child to work well together, right? And so this in particular, this is often, you know, if for those of you that also work with families, right? Parents always want to come in and be like, how do I contain my child, right? How do I discipline my kid? Tell me how to fix this. And we say, yes, okay, right, okay. And there are, we also need to have these other two aspects of this relationship in order for this discipline to work. Because this is when we see instances of discipline getting too intense, or maybe in some cases for families, the discipline not happening at all, the containing, right? And so for many families, they get into a pattern of things and they go from extreme, you know, levels to lesser levels because they get burnt out. So we think of often about these things of sometimes parents are so, you know, at their capacity. So what's the minimum amount? Because a lot of what I feel as a parent now too is, well, this is what good parents do, right? And you need to have your kids dressed in the best outfits and they need to be in all the activities and they need to be, et cetera, et cetera. And that is such a high expectation to attain. There's no way that anyone's ever going to be that great of a parent all the time. And so again, that reference of good enough, what do we need to do for minimum coverage? And if we can do that, we're probably going to be fine. And then we can adjust these other areas if we can do that minimum, right?
Hey, Lauren, I realize there's a typo on this page and that's my mistake. So it should provide minimum coverage, but maximum sustainability. So
Absolutely.
That's the other side of that equation.
Yes. Yes, we want to, and I'm so glad you mentioned that. Exactly. It's what can we do for it's essentially like, what do we need to do as parents, and need being like, we have to do this in order to have a good relationship with our child without taxing parents all the time, that perfectionism. So we want to be able to continue on and do this for the long haul rather than fluctuating based on our energy levels for the day. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Tim. And so this is the one component I'm going to cover, and then I'm going to pass it back over to Tim. So first and foremost, what we have to do as parents and what we need to have our parents understand is that we have to accept our children and allow them to feel that they are fully accepted within this family and for who they are. That doesn't mean that we allow them to harm us, right? Or hurt the family, but they need to feel that they are fully loved and accepted within that. So oftentimes in research, it'll talk about, I am going to, parents are going to give specific reinforcement for a child's good behavior, the things that we want to see more of, only when that child is behaving appropriately, right? Versus in developmental literature, sometimes when they talk about positive parenting, it's discussed as emotional responsiveness, sensitivity, and warm involvement. So when we talk about acceptance, we really have this feeling of emotional acceptance, right? We believe that this is demonstrated through actions where children feel they can be themselves, they can be autonomous, right? Without threatening that relationship security. So my love is not contingent on how you behave, right? We still love and we have high expectations, which is what Tim will talk about now.
Thank you. So, contain. So we could have used the term discipline. The value of the word contain or containment is that it's less loaded. Historically, it doesn't have all the connotations that discipline does, and the idea is that perhaps parents will be curious about this term that's less familiar to them. So we argue that at minimum, behavioral containment begins with strict limits on children's use of aggressive antisocial behavior. And in line with Patterson's coercion hypothesis, the chief goal here is to avoid parents' inadvertent reinforcement of children's use of coercion, which is Patterson referred to as coercion training. And so I would point out that this is different and is an important difference from a primary focus on compliance or disobedience. And for anyone interested, I published a paper a while back trying to make the case that we really should be focusing on children's use of sorry. We should be really should be focusing on parents' use of children's use of coercion more so than their disobedience. That's really the behavior that is most developmentally significant in terms of downstream negative outcomes. Now, the Patterson group, Oregon Social Learning Center group, defined functionally containment or discipline as raising the cost of children's use of coercion. This is based on the application of the matching law. If children have choices about which behavior they're going to use, then you want the choice of behaving in a coercive way. You want that to be an unattractive choice, a choice that has more cost than choosing a less coercive or non-coercive behavior. So what this means, if you're trying to really promote a positive parent-child relationship, a socializing relationship, and particularly for children who are strong-willed, then effective discipline oftentimes means selective discipline. It means you want to choose your battles wisely. Now, that phrase is very commonly used, but it's seldom unpacked. And we try to unpack that and make explicit what are the battles that parents should focus on. So in that paper I referenced earlier, you'll find this funnel, a hierarchy, if you will, of possible target behaviors. Now, some parents have the luxury of being able to insist on compliance at all times. So they're targeting any instance of non-compliance. That's a punishable offense, so to speak. Other parents who may be prone to dysregulation or have kids who are prone to dysregulation or who have a history perhaps of some mutually coercive exchanges have to move down this funnel. For example, it may be that they're focused only on non-compliance to direct command. So you don't punish a child unless there has been a direct command that's been ignored or not complied with, or non-compliance to direct commands plus warning, which further narrows the equation when you might use discipline. Even further limiting it, there's non-compliance to specific do and don't rules. So it narrows your focus as parents of when you're engaging in a disciplinary encounter. Even further is non-compliance to specific don't rules only. The developmental research would suggest that children's capacity to follow don't rules develops sooner than their capacity to follow do rules. And then further down this funnel is children's use of physical and verbal coercion or physical coercion only. For some families, you are working at that level. You don't have the luxury to be thinking about disobedience more generally. You're simply trying to establish a home where coercion is not the primary input strategy. That's the beginning task there. Lead. This is another area of parent-based interventions that's not often talked about. You can think of it as in a couple of ways. Leading begins with explicit statements opposing antisocial behavior and values. So it's an explicit endorsement of parents' beliefs and values, presumably pro-social in nature. Okay, but it's also moderate. It's also parents being an example worth following. so often in parent-based literature, particularly the behavioral literature, it's operant-based. There's less, even though we think about social learning and modeling, we oftentimes in our intervention work don't think so much about the example of the parent, the model that's being given, and what does that mean and how we work with parents. So our way of promoting that piece is to refer to it as a distinct area called leading. Okay. Now we see leading as also involving what we call the third option. There are some behaviors that fall that you're not sure you want to actively affirm or other, and at the same time, those behaviors may not warrant an active intervention. Let's say, for example, your child is picking his or her nose, or belching, or doing something, has friends that you don't particularly like. There are a lot of things that are in the gray area, if you will. And so the third option, assuming you have a good relationship with your child, is your opportunity to present what your family's values are. What do you believe, let's say, about making harmful comments, rude comments to someone who's doing something you don't like, or versus your values, the behavior of the child, right? So if a child is calling a sibling names, but not in a way that seems to be that hurtful to the child, but it keeps persisting, you might say, we don't like to hurt people in our family, and I think your sister's not real pleased about your calling her names. That is juxtaposing what the family's values are with the observation of what the child is doing, but then stopping, not moving further to introduce any sort of consequence or discipline. And the period at the end of that third option is probably the hardest thing for parents to do, because parents often want some guarantees, so to speak, that the message has been received and maybe the acted upon. But by simply offering, these are our family's values, this is what you're doing, I'm not sure what you're doing fits those values, is probably sufficient in the area of leading. Lauren?
Thanks. So one of the things that was really important to us when working on these two books was understanding a lot of research that has been done with families, right? And what we know about many of the early literature related to parenting is really from a particular population, if you will, that weird population that is talked about oftentimes. So understanding that, like Tim was talking about earlier, many were just mothers. Many were white families, often middle to upper class, right? And so we want to be very thoughtful in delivery of interventions, and as we talk about parenting, to look at it in the eyes of all parents and understand important aspects of families' identity and potentially intersectional identities, and how does that influence who they are. So many conversations that we've had within our department at the University of Arkansas related to clinical work, we've talked about how important it is to have conversations with families about who are you, not just in your values, right, which is an important conversation to have when we talk about this intervention as well, but who are you in terms of how do you identify your family, and what are essential components of your identity. So if anyone's heard of the addressing lens, which talks about sort of aspects of ourselves in which we are in positions of power, or potentially from historically marginalized populations, we have to understand that these are important ways in which we navigate the world. And as clinicians, we need to bring that absolutely to the front at the beginning. We in our area in Arkansas, there's a big religious undertones that drives families and their values and who they are, oftentimes causes tension with who they want to be, or what they want for their family, and then what's happening within their home. And so having these conversations are really important about and what does this mean to you? Who are you, and how do we talk about these things rather than brushing or whitewashing over and assuming things of families, right? So we wanted to be very thoughtful about that, not only in how we wrote the books, but also in encouraging clinicians to be very forward thinking and talking to families at the very start, how their family identifies in many ways. So we just wanted to say thank you to everyone. And this is my contact information and Tim's contact information if you would like to chat with us later or ask questions later. But we're also wanted to make sure we left plenty of time to talk with you now and field some of those questions.
Would you prefer that I read the questions out, or can you all see them in the chat?
That would be great. That would be great.
That would be lovely.
Okay, so the first question was whether you'd be willing to share your slides with people afterwards. Okay.
Sure.
Lauren, you all right with that? Yeah.
Yes.
Although I have to fix the typo.
We'll fix the typo before we send it out.
Great. Okay. So we'll send that out when we send out the recording to everybody who's registered. The second question was around what the outcomes of children are when parents who have healthcare issues that are long and serious, like cancer or autoimmune disabilities.
Can you say that again? So is the question how to support parents who are facing chronic, serious medical issues? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Or specifically those that may involve a terminal illness?
They did not say terminal illness. They said long and serious.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Maria, please feel free to unmute and clarify.
There. I love the question. That really speaks to the issue of health, makes health central, right?
Mm-hmm.
And structure.
Both questions. That would both.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Have you had experience with working with parents who have those challenges? Maria? I've lost
me. Only until just like recently. I think COVID has made a lot more healthcare issues with some kiddos.
Right.
And I have some currently.
What I like about your question, Maria, is that it requires that the clinician first takes stock of the conditions under which child rearing is happening. What is it the parent has to work with? What are their resources? In what ways are they limited? And how can you fashion or tailor an approach to supporting this parent that fits those conditions? It's not taking something off the shelf and saying, this is the only size we have. It requires tailoring it. Now, that's why that one slide where there was a typo, I think, was particularly important. It was, what are the minimum conditions that are required for a child to feel accepted, contained, for parents to be leading, okay? And and minimum and maximum sustainability. And so with that parent, it would be, so what is within your bandwidth to do that brings to bear a socializing relationship for your children? And that's really, in some ways, one of the better examples of how our model could be tailored, how it lends itself to tailoring, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is a great example, I think, of too, in terms of how you have to balance all of these components together, right? So health is a really important aspect of families and how much capacity that parent has. And so sometimes I have conversations with parents of, and what support are you getting in this difficult, as you're navigating a relationship that's potentially rocky too. And how do you find support outside of the home, or what are your needs? And oftentimes parents are easy to push that aside because they're so used to, either putting out fires or dealing with what their children need first. And you lose your capacity to address more of those larger issues when you are constantly feeling depleted. So for a family that has, or a parent that has more significant health needs, they may have to do more for themselves to be at a certain level, while similarly what Tim is saying, understanding, what are they capable of, and maybe that expectation or what they're hoping they could do if they weren't having so many ailments has to be adjusted, and understanding those goals maybe then need to be adjusted with where they're at. Often support is really oftentimes what parents need is who do you need to bring into this equation to help you?
Dr. Bro, other questions?
Yeah, there was a question around either if you had a Spanish version of either of your books, or recommendations for similar books for Spanish speaking families or families from a Latinx background.
Right. So I was in DC in August at the APA convention, and I spoke to APA Books, the publisher of our parenting book. And I was told that the book is being translated into Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese. Now, I have no idea the status of those efforts, but that's what I was told. So it's worth assuming that they're being honest about that.
Eventually, who knows how long those things take, but yes,
Yeah.
we're hoping that they'll be
Right.
more widely available.
And our practitioner book, for whatever reason, is apparently being translated into Indonesian. I'm not sure what that's about.
Someone wanted it there.
Yeah.
All right. So another question came up around what makes this treatment specific for aggressive children versus non-aggressive children with behavior problems.
I'll take that. So again, it goes back to my comments about coercion, and the research is pretty clear. If you've never read Patterson's coercion hypothesis, which is a really difficult read, but it's such a gold mine, and it underlies so much of parent-based interventions. And we cite it all the time, and I'm not sure how many people have ever read it. And there have been multiple updates and iterations of the coercion hypothesis, but the bottom line is that coercion is just a really toxic behavior for a child to take forward developmentally. And what can happen from that, in addition to learning to use coercion as an influence strategy, they can adopt a set of beliefs about their who's in charge, about adults not being able to contain them. We actually did a study where we measured children's sense of containment, or mother, father, and teacher in charge. And we had purposefully created items that ask kids, who's in charge? You want to go play outside, it's raining, your mom says you can't. Can she make you stay inside? So it's really sort of provoking, in a way, the child the question of, who's in charge? And so sometimes children not only develop a pattern of coercion, they start to believe that they are not containable, that they call all their own shots. And that's a very dangerous thing. Our research shows that regardless of the quality of the discipline, children who had a low sense of containment were engaging in a lot of externalizing problem behaviors. They were the masters of their behavior. I was actually working with the parents the other day, and they finally were convinced enough to implement timeout for their highly coercive child. And they had been reluctant to do so. And so I prepped them well, and they were ready for the more than an hour it took to establish it. And the child responded beautifully. Okay. But his little brother was freaked out by this. He couldn't believe that his brother had gone over to the dark side. He would appeal to his brother, we have got to defeat them. So it was like they both, and this is a child who had announced to his dad a couple of weeks ago that, I'm in charge, I'm dad. So this was sort of the belief system that comes with coercion, the persistent use of coercion, which then escalates to aggression and other antisocial behaviors. So if you really want a marker for who's at risk. Look for coercion, because that's the developmental precursor to aggression.
So I'm gonna jump for a second and ask one that I
Oh.
think kind of relates to this. If you conceptualize this as working for families with subclinical as well as clinical concerns, it sounds like the answer is yes, but if you want to elaborate more on that.
I'm gonna let Lauren answer that one.
Yeah, absolutely. We had this conversation a lot when we were in the beginning stages of writing this parenting book. And so I think the practitioner's guide is geared toward, clinically significant families coming in under distress, right? And at the same time, a lot of these principles really can be used with families regardless of the level of I guess, aggressive behavior or concerning behavior. And I think one of the ways that we talked about it and framed it was because there's this feeling, I feel sometimes myself, but in other parents I've talked to now, especially with young children, it really feels like there's a lot of pressure to be this perfect parent, which I've talked about previously. So the more information that we gather, the more that we're connected, it's sort of like, you have to present your family in this glowing light, and you, in order to be a good family, you must do X, Y, and Z. And so we talked about how that can be really toxic for some families, where they start focusing on the wrong goals of, my child needs to be this, or we have to present this way as a family in order for us to be good and be good parents, or our children to be good. And what ends up happening in that process of losing that, the heart of what a family is, or what a parent-child relationship should be, we unintentionally may put expectations on children that strain the relationship. So that doesn't, I consider this almost as like, it's a way to relieve parents of that pressure to be perfect. You just have to be good enough, and your kid is going to be who they are, regardless of if you want them to do X, Y, and Z. And so it matters less about being perfect externally, and it's more important about how you feel as a family. So I think it could work for anybody, and that's really why we wrote this. This doesn't have to be in partnership always with someone that's coming in for therapy. Even, like, people can read this and hopefully help them tweak in their own lives and adjust based on like, why am I uncomfortable, or why does it feel like I'm stressed so much, right? Maybe I need to address some of these things that are going on.
We also address in the parenting book, as well the practitioner book as well, the very important fact that our as a field, our understanding of the influence of parenting on socialization has morphed over the years as we've learned more. It used to be that we assumed that parenting was the primary causal mechanism in children's development, and genetics was a small player. And other sources of influence didn't matter as much. And now it seems to have flipped. I think, work by Sandra Scar and people like that has shown pretty convincingly that so much of children's developmental trajectory is shaped by behavioral genetics and by other contexts like peers in the media. And so it doesn't mean that parenting is not important, but you have to be wise about how parents are important. Certainly, managing the abuse of coercion is a key job. And that's sort of job number one, in addition to keeping them safe, of course, and well-fed, et cetera. But if you want to influence their developmental trajectory, that's a good thing. That matters a lot. And other things that we might spend time on probably matter. We have less control over, whether they're going to be a talented musician or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
What are the parenting, or what are the biggest parenting techniques that create that coercion environment?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. Well, usually it's emotional discomfort. Patterson's coercion hypothesis was based on the premise of escape conditioning. We don't like feeling bad, and we'll do things to escape feeling bad. And so if our child is not complying, if not doing what we want them to do, and we holler at them and holler at them, and they keep resisting, at some point we get frustrated and we may skid in. Okay. Or we blow up and get really harsh and angry. And those are both poorly managed emotion-laden situations. And so, and then once that we do that, we learn that this is one way to escape that difficult, unpleasant feeling, then we tend to repeat it. So that's the whole premise of coercion, is that it's used to escape what is unpleasant in your feelings.
I want to try to lump together two questions in the sake of time. There was a question around kind of how, particularly Lauren, you reconcile this approach with your PCIT training, and then a question kind of around some of the resistance that's been coming out recently, or reluctance for parents to use timeout with young children. And so kind of thinking why this resistance is there. And the commenter had said it seems like a lot of it depends on how timeout is implemented.
100%. So I actually wrote an article a few years ago now that talked about the myths of timeout. So I think there was this big movement essentially trying to argue that timeout was traumatic for children. And unfortunately, some of the literature that they were citing, just as an example, they were citing literature that was taking pre-weaned rats away from their mothers and just never returning them. And that was their justification. So I think some of the arguments has been based on stretches of science in many ways, and understanding what timeout is and how it should be appropriately implemented are a really big component. And I do that work all the time in PCIT, and I see Stephen Kurtz is here and he knows. he's an expert PCIT individual as well, and provider. So that's often a comment that we get, and a lot of it is around psychoeducation about what does it actually look like and how do you do it well. And I do not think that this is in contrast with PCIT. We talk about timeout in both of these books and how to implement it appropriately. I think how it is a little different in ways to PCIT is that we are covering a wide range of developmental levels. And so it's, putting a 16-year-old in timeout probably is not developmentally appropriate. And so having other ways of navigating this relationship and containing adolescents and other children is really important. And another component of this, I think, that even I talk to my graduate students about is, we have evidence-based treatments, and we have many evidence-based treatments for a reason. They work for some people, right? And then sometimes they don't. So if someone comes in with depression, you can do a CBT strategy, and that person may just not take to it at all. And that's why we have ACT, right? We have ACT strategy too. And that may be the way that or what families need. So PCIT is so effective, and it works for so many families. And I use it all the time with families. And sometimes there is so much more going on to a family with a family, rather than I need to learn how to sit down and play with my kids. That it becomes a more global and necessary approach. And that's when I sometimes feel like if families have so much going on, PCIT might not be addressing all of those things. And so maybe understanding and checking in with these components can actually be a great addition to PCIT without abandoning the intervention either. But yes, hopefully I'll try to be concise, because now it's 12. I think you're muted.
I'm still muted. I was gonna say, I see that it is now the end of our hour together. I just want to thank everyone for being here and to let those who joined late know that we will be sending out the recording and slides from today's talk within about a week or so. So you'll have access to the full recording if you weren't able to be here for the whole time. Thank you again, Dr. Cavell and Dr. Kretsch.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Great questions.